Welcome to everyone joining us for the ACUN's 2021 annual meeting, a global online conference. I'm Abby Williams, Director of the Institute for Global Leadership and Professor of the Practice of International Politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. I am also a past chair of ACUNS. The John W. Holmes Memorial Lecture is always a highlight on the agenda of the ACUN's annual meeting. It is indeed the keynote of the annual meeting. As many ACUN's veterans will know, the lecture was inaugurated in 1989 in honor of a founding member of ACUN's, who was emblematic of our organization's mission to foster dialogue and debate between scholars and practitioners. A Canadian diplomat and a member of the Preparatory Commission of the United Nations, John Holmes was a lifelong believer in the principle that scholarly examination of the United Nations was essential for improving the functioning of the organization and for the wider operation of global governance. Holmes spent much of his later career in academia, based at the University of Toronto, and was a driving force behind the foundation of ACUNS. It is in this spirit of constant improvement of the UN system that I welcome with great pleasure my friend and former UN colleague, Lord Mark Malloch-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundations. Over the past 32 years, some of the world's most influential policymakers and academics have delivered the Holmes Lecture. But we've never had someone deliver the Holmes Lecture twice, until today. In 2007, Mark delivered the Holmes Lecture on the subject, Can the UN be Reformed? Mark's distinguished career has allowed him to wrestle with global challenges in different ways and in varied worlds. After beginning his career as a journalist with The Economist, he worked in the international humanitarian system, including at UNHCR. He was subsequently at the forefront of an important movement, which emerged in the 1990s that sought to end humanitarian suffering through tackling political root causes rather than waiting for the symptoms of political failure to manifest themselves. The NGO he played a key role in founding, the International Crisis Group, remains the gold standard for policymakers searching for grounded political analysis and innovative yet feasible solutions. Mark continued his career in international institutions, serving as a vice president at the World Bank, UNDP administrator, and chief of staff and deputy to Secretary General Kofi Annan, whose memory we cherish. Upon leaving the UN, Mark served as a Foreign Office Minister in Gordon Brown's cabinet, overseeing UK policy on Africa, Asia, and the United Nations. In his remarkable book, The Unfinished Global Revolution, The Road to International Cooperation, Mark argues for more effective and inclusive international institutions. As the Financial Times wrote, what is attractive about the book is the combination of detail, authority, and humility derived from decades of trying to make international cooperation work. Before I turn over to Mark, a word about the format of the session. Mark's speech will last about 20 minutes, followed by a discussion with me for 15 to 20 minutes. We will then open it up to the audience. We encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A function in the chat box. Please add your name, organization, and if you wish, your country, when you are submitting your question. Mark, we look forward eagerly to what you have to say today. It is a pleasure to welcome you. Over to you.
Well, Abby, thank you very, very much, and to Lise and everyone else for this invitation. And if I may, I'm going to start with just one point of, if you like, memory, and that's just to honour Edward Mortimer, who has been so involved with this organisation, I think, over the years. I can only imagine that he must have facilitated many of those listening in their academic research. He was one of the world's natural academics, a fellow of All Souls until the time of his death. But, you know, more notably, perhaps also a journalist with the spirit of curiosity that came. But for today, perhaps remembered best as Kofi's speechwriter and director of communications during most of Kofi's 2 terms at the UN. And so Abby and I both worked very closely with him. And I think I'll say only one thing, which is about Edward further, which is just to say, in a way, he was a sort of a Gladstone after his times, a liberal of a sort of century earlier. When Gladstone was buried, he insisted that the national colours of Armenia be on his coffin to celebrate or respect his efforts to secure minority rights for Armenia within the bigger empire within which its peoples were already being persecuted at that time. And, you know, Edward was a similar champion of these extraordinary causes, whether it was the Tamils or the Palestinians, and he was a champion on the 38th floor and in many other places. So, as I say, I suspect I would just like to say at the beginning of these words, we've lost a great comrade and colleague in Edward's passing. To just, Abby was kind enough to point out that I've got to give this lecture twice, which means one is forced to reflect on what one said the first time, whether it in any way has held up or not. And in that 2007 lecture, I speculated that it would take a big global shock or disruption to create the conditions for a real San Francisco moment, as it's often called, a major UN reset of the kind which had established the organization in 1945-44. And, you know, in a way, there have been a number of, by any normal standards, major crises since. We had the financial crisis of 2008, 9, and 10. We've had the current dramatic public health crisis of COVID. We've had the longer running crisis of climate change. And yet, if we're frank, the UN remains stubbornly unchanged. There have been reforms at the margin, but we've not seen the response to these crises that we might have hoped for and anticipated. The financial crisis that I referred to really kicked the G20 up a notch or two from a meeting of finance ministers to a significant head of state meeting on the annual sort of diary of such gatherings in the world, and gave it an authority which has since somewhat been eclipsed, but which, you know, created hope that here was the beginnings of the makings of an economic security council, the meeting of the top 20 economies in the world, representing 85% or 90% by some estimates of the global economy between them. The COVID crisis has led to a first important report around strengthening public health institutions. But, you know, and there is some prospect, I think, that there may be some improvement of WHO and the wider ecosystem of public health institutions, but nothing like the real creation and kickstarting of a truly robust global public health system, which might stop at the beginning a COVID-like crisis in the future. And on climate change, despite the efforts at Paris and in other climate meetings and coming up in Glasgow later this year, no real change in terms of a more robust architecture to handle the global response to climate. It's still an entirely largely voluntary best efforts system with lots of free riders whose commitments fall well short of what is needed if climate change is to be contained. And, if we turn back to the UN itself, despite these crises, and I acknowledge there's not been a political security crisis perhaps yet on the same scale as the financial and health and environmental ones I have mentioned, still no move to remake the Security Council to make it more representative of the global political economy today. No significant revamping of the Secretary General's powers. In fact, I think despite the best efforts of both the incumbent and his predecessor, if anything, we've seen a steady deterioration in the global recognition and power and authority of Secretary Generals. And chronic financial difficulties remain across the UN system. The US withholdings under Trump being an echo of earlier withholdings that we had to contend with in Abby's and my time under Kofi Annan at the UN. And even the most supportive donors, such as the Europeans, I was struck, one of my colleagues in doing some research for this speech pointed out to me that a number of significant European countries give less, for example, to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights than we at the Open Society Foundations give. Really an anomalous and extraordinary situation. So even though the current Secretary General is, I know, as reform-minded as any of his predecessors, he's ultimately been limited, at least so far in his first term, to tinkering with the resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator systems. But these are small R reforms, not big R reforms. And I complained both in the speech I gave in 2007 and in the book that Abby was kind enough to refer to, that we're sort of reform obsessed at the UN. And I said in the speech then that, quote, the world wants more of the UN and the organization is only able to deliver less. This issue of demand outrunning capacity is a perennial permanent challenge for every Secretary General and leader of the organization. But, now is a particularly bad moment, I suspect we could all agree. At present, we have as dysfunctional a Security Council as at any time since the height of the Cold War. We see situation after situation where there is some limited UN engagement in the second tier conflicts, if you like, particularly around trying to kind of mitigate some of the worst impacts of those conflicts on civilians, but very little of at least successful mediation or conflict resolution of the kind that we hope from this organization. And we see the UN continues to be kind of essentially locked out of the bigger conflicts, whether it is in Iran or even in Venezuela or Syria. The UN is largely on the side of the field on these conflicts. And, I'm very struck by the reflection of this in Antonio Guterres's second term manifesto letter to member states before his successful re-election, compared to that of his first appeal for their support. In the first, now 4 or 5 years ago, we saw him position himself as the diplomat peacemaker who would go and engage in resolving conflicts. And in the second, that role has almost been entirely overlooked and dropped in favor of the campaigner crusader on issues such as climate change. And you can understand why that pivot away from the traditional world's chief diplomat by this Secretary General. When even a solution in Cyprus eludes him, or when his visit to Tripoli in search of a solution in Libya, where there has subsequently been some really important progress, but nevertheless, when his visit to Tripoli as mediator immediately led to a bombardment of that city by one side of the conflict, you know, I think, recognized, and I imagine with some sense of personal bitterness, that he simply didn't have the authority to bring these different parties to the table. Indeed, many members of his own Security Council were divided on both sides of that conflict. So why not go to climate, where even if the victories will only be felt some generations down the road, long after his term is over, at least it offers at, if you like, the aspirational level, a more comforting space to work than these stubborn conflicts that will not go away. And yet, of course, the UN has been here before. And even when the ice floes were still secure and the melting barely begun, the UN of the Cold War years was able to, while locked out of the major political conflicts of the day, busy itself with decolonization, with technical assistance to the new governments, with a development and humanitarian agenda to substitute for the gridlock in the Security Council on so many conflicts of politics, and even an extremely useful peacekeeping role, if not a conflict resolution role in the Middle East and elsewhere. That was the years where I began my UN career. Principally, I'd worked in New York, but then principally in the Geneva agencies in UNHCR. And I was stunned then and remain struck by how we tried to keep New York and the political side of the UN at arm's length. And, you know, I found many years later, on becoming administrator of UNDP, that my predecessor but one had toyed with even dropping the UN from the official name of the organization and changing its distinctive blue UN logo to a more anonymous green, and renaming of the organization the World Development Organization. And, you know, this, if you like, kind of closing of the main political channel to the organization and the forcing of UN activities into the tributaries on the sides of that main channel or river, you know, has led to many of these important developments in the non-political central sphere, if you like. And Abby referred to one of them at the beginning, the back door of humanitarianism. But behind that back door of a kind of Red Cross-like support to the victims of conflict, unlike the Red Cross, a much more political attention to trying to address the root causes of conflict. And Abby's correct to refer to the forming of the ICG, which for me came on the back of a career in first career, UN career in humanitarian work, where I saw that humanitarian assistance alone was a band-aid and that we needed to address those root causes, not in a partisan way, not in a way that, you know, favored one side's civilians over the other, but in a way which really tackled the politics behind the conflict in search of a mediated solution. But this grew up as a small industry, again, around the side of the Security Council, which remained this no man's land in terms of a place where you could get things done. But, you know, this work in many ways found its own sort of high watermark and has receded since in the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which was, you know, adopted by the UN towards the end of Kofi's tenure as Secretary General. We viewed it as a huge breakthrough and triumph. But then it was awfully misused in the Libya context and was allowed to be used to justify something which didn't just stop the killings of civilians in Benghazi, the intention of the Security, many of those in the Security Council who voted for the resolution, but was used by the British and the French and ultimately the US to pursue a much wider agenda of regime change in Libya. And that, in a sense, responsibility to protect, I would dare to claim to people who will, as academics, have a much more refined view of this, in a sense, has been a doctrine almost of the Walking Dead since. So again, we've entered an era where a lot of the main roadways are constrained and blocked to the UN, and we are forced to look at other ways around it, and hence a Secretary General embracing climate change in his second term, but also embracing the championing of strengthened public health, as well as, of course, of this agenda of humanitarian and development activities. Because, as I say, the door has been slammed shut on most of the political work that a Secretary General might have expected to do. And, you know, one might say the story ends there, but it never does, because in the same way that in the Cold War, innovative Secretary Generals and UN colleagues could kind of get their toe in the door in some political situations, that remains the same today. And I'm very, very struck as the president of OSF, how frequently at the moment colleagues come to me, often my high-powered, members of my high-powered advocacy team in Washington or Brussels, to say, who at the UN should we talk to? Because there are now an emerging set of crises where the big powers have played themselves out of the game. And the two most obvious are Myanmar and Afghanistan, where suddenly in the case of Myanmar, the UN Special Representative, Secretary General Special Representative is again, you know, a very significant figure, because other figures other than the Chinese and one or two ASEAN leaders have essentially either left the pitch on their own or been forced off the pitch by the change of government there. The envoy herself, of course, has not yet been able to secure real entry points with or access with this new government. But similarly now in Afghanistan, as we come close to the American withdrawal, there's suddenly new interest in how to enhance and expand and rebuild the UN mandate in Afghanistan. It may not come with a peacekeeping force attached to it, but it is going to be a critical source of diplomatic engagement, of monitoring developments, of trying to keep an international presence and eye on the potentially tragic course of events there, or possibly tragic course of events there, as Western NATO forces withdraw. So, you know, the UN, in a strange way, even when the world is at its worst, there remain these key pieces that, as they fall off the table, the UN needs to catch. But, you know, as we look forward, what trends may shape the UN in this period of political contraction and restriction, if I can call it that? And, you know, I think the first question is, will the UN able to focus largely on climate or humanitarian activities, but, you know, constrained on the political side? Will it be a leg with one stool missing that automatically falls over? Or, as happened during the Cold War, can it make itself useful even as it waits for global politics to rebalance in a more positive way? And I suspect the answer to that depends around four issues. The whole issue now of US-China competition, which has been imported into the UN, and what that means for the survival of UN universality in the face of attempts of UN capture by both sides in the US-China argument. I'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, a value versus values versus interests, a debate, which again, I'm going to revert to. Third, can the ambition of middle powers be harnessed into a coalition, as has often been tried before, to give the UN teeth and effectiveness and impact, even as the big elephants fight? And fourth and finally, the quiet remaking of the UN into a multi-constituency organization where civil society and private sector actors start to more institutionalize their presence and role and allow the UN to get beyond the inherent conservatism of governments alone to this more multi-stakeholder model of the future. Let me first quickly say a word about China. You know, we've seen in the last 14 years or so, China really begin to turn its economic power into political influence at the UN and around the world. It deftly exploited the UN's, the Trump administration's retreat from multilateralism. And it's flexed its muscles in the UN, where it's now the second largest contributor to the assessed budget. And it's allowed that to strengthen its representation across the secretariat, agencies, funds, and programs. In the absence of that US engagement, Chinese nationals are now installed at the helm of 4 of 15 UN specialized agencies, more than any other state. China pays less than the US annually, 12% versus 22% of the annual UN budget, but it pays on time. And its budget share has increased dramatically since 2010, when it was paying just 3%. China is the 10th largest contributor to UN peacekeeping operations, providing more uniformed personnel than the rest of the 5 permanent members combined. It is the only country in the top 10 in both troop and financial contributions, and provides a trust fund to the Secretary General's office, which also gives it added influence going forward. The US has sort of woken up to this threat in the new administration and has struck back. The new US ambassador, Linda Greenfield-Thomas, gave recent congressional testimony, which really seemed to suggest that she anticipated taking on China within the UN. And I think it is really important that the US does not try and turn the UN into a place where the values of democracy are pitted against authoritarianism in some sort of bear pit remaking of the organization into a new 2-block competitive forum where both are trying to win control of the UN for their own ideological state capture, if I can put it that way. And instead, I think what we have to see is something of a triangulation between the UN and those middle powers, and many in the developing world trying to hold the UN true to its charter principles, while on the other 2 sides of the triangle sit the US at one end and China on the other. And the need to manage that by the UN governments, secretariat, and others as a whole is going to critically shape whether the UN can preserve its universality and its unique legitimacy and access that comes from that. A word on values second. These are becoming ever more contentious, north, south, east, west. We see human rights and democracy assailed. Freedom House reports their decline over 15 years. More than half the world now is living under semi or non-democratic governments. And and we see even in democratic governments, violent culture wars at home between left and right, highly polarized political environments shaped by fake news, etc. And, within that, for the UN to, if you like, maintain the inherent liberal internationalism and inclusiveness of its charter and those founders becomes harder and harder in these global and national culture wars to which we're all being subjected. And third, can we stoke the ambition of those middle powers, the Swedens, the Singapores, the Norways, the Ghanas, so many of them who are influential in their own regions, but who need to combine in an ambitious effort to save the UN for the great majority of the world who do not live within the borders of a superpower. And, you know, I want to be clear that I think the US will be very much in the Biden administration an ally of that, but the leadership must be of others, because if it is a US leadership, then it just invokes this US-China competition, if I can put it like that. And, you know, I particularly noticed a pamphlet written by Susanna Malcora and Bruce Jones on this, which I think was, you know, extraordinary and very interesting set of proposals. Finally, to the fourth, civil society and the private sector, let me just say, you know, that is not new. Under Kofi Annan, we commissioned from the then, well, from ex-President Cardoso of Brazil, a report on the role of civil society at the UN, and put in black and white, governments were quick to reject nearly all of its recommendations, but the seeping intrusion of civil society into the affairs of the UN continues, despite the best efforts of governments to largely block them at every turn from any role of any real influence. And that is critical to the lifeblood of the organization. It is where the renewal intellectually and in terms of ideas and campaigns will come from. And, you know, I think this electronic communications, which is a consequence of COVID, in a sense expands the UN network, and as the Secretary General has talked about for his second term, allows the kind of networked UN in not just comms, but in structure that he is ambitious for. And I think he will be, you know, a leader and enabler of much of that change. And the private sector similarly needs to be included in that more networked ecosystem of friends and allies of multilateralism. The private sector in many ways has had a much better COVID crisis than its government counterparts. The speed with which it developed vaccines, admittedly in partnership with government R&D resources, which were critical, you know, it shows the power of science and technology to both provide a very quick solution to a major global problem, even if now we are confronted with the failure to make that solution universally available through vaccine equity. But that same spirit of invention and entrepreneurship, you know, is coming to the fore in climate change, where we're seeing less and less focus just on sort of rationed use of resources, but the pairing of changes in how we organize ourselves in terms of sharing and circular economy, with the pairing with and partnering with the power of technology in the private sector to drive an energy revolution, and beyond that, a revolution in consumption and lifestyle, which removes the prospect that we've all got to return to sackcloth and Birkenstocks in order to live within a climate managed world, that there is a decent life out there for all if we invest in a greening of our recovery. And the partner to that is not just governments and their capital, but it is the private sector and its innovation. So I close with saying that there are, as always with the UN, lots of sort of green shoots of hope and possibility, but they sit within a pretty bleak overall political landscape, itself a reflection not of failures at the UN so much as because the UN just holds a mirror to the world, and at the moment that's a broken mirror because it's a broken world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for those candid and forward-thinking remarks. Let me start the conversation. You know, as you know, the UN was founded as the result of a crisis and the Second World War. And you've said that achieving reform of the UN may actually take a crisis. Does this pandemic, which has been so traumatic for people all across the world, does this pandemic provide a moment of crisis to demonstrate the organization's relevance and impact? And as we had the financial crisis in 2008, which you mentioned in your remarks. What is different from this moment from 2008 with the financial crisis? And can the COVID-19 crisis provide the impetus needed for reform?
Abby, thanks. And I think the answer is it should, but it probably won't. I think a lot of the leadership in terms of marshalling resources has come from other places in the UN, and that's always when it comes to money, that tends to be the case. But, you know, I think Kristalina Georgieva at the IMF has in many ways led the charge in terms of trying to assemble the resources and cost out what it would take to get to something closer to an appropriate universal vaccine solution. And, you know, the early days of COVAX, the current scheme, which, you know, may be overwhelmed because it's not been able to, as yet, deliver the solutions people want. You know, it was foundations like, and leadership from people like Bill Gates and the African CDC, which really made this happen, rather than centrally the UN itself, with of course the exception of the World Health Organization, which has, you know, tried to play as effective a role as it can in a very difficult circumstance. But I think what you're going to see coming out of this crisis is, unless the Wuhan lab issue blows up in a way that it destroys trust between scientists, is I think it's very plausible to imagine we will come out of this crisis with better networks of scientists sharing information in an earlier, more rational way, because they recognize their if you like, responsibility to humanity to improve that. I think you'll see better networks of private sector actors, again, trying to make sure that there are solutions available in terms of new generations of vaccine or vaccines, etc. But I'm not sure that the response is going to strengthen the UN itself, because, you know, I don't think that many governments or citizens have seen it as so central. There's been a great role by UNICEF alongside WHO on vaccine distribution, etc. But there's not been the sense of the UN seizing the leadership, as, for example, happened at the time of the HIV/AIDS crisis, where, you know, it was Kofi Annan who seized the leadership of that, and who, you know, deployed UNAIDS and WHO and the World Bank, you know, and who called for, and in a sense, well, was appointed patron of an organization that sits on the edge of the UN proper, the Global Fund. But we haven't seen that kind of, if you like, mobilizing and clarifying UN leadership in this crisis that we saw with HIV/AIDS a generation ago.
And still on this issue of reform, you said that the UN remains stubbornly unchanged. Fundamental reform of the UN, not the tinkering, which you've mentioned, would require difficult concessions of rights and privileges by UN member states. What incentives are available to help governments to give ground if you're going to have fundamental reform?
Well, as always, you know, it depends where you sit as a government. You know, if you are a large government of a large country, you know, concessions come hard, and it doesn't need to be just the US or China. You know, it's a phenomenon you see equally in a Brazil or in India. Very large countries are, in a sense, their own global system in microcosm, and, you know, often have an impatience about, you know, the sort of burden sharing and the concessions of multilateralism. Smaller countries, whether developed or developing, you know, often by contrast, see the value of some degree of pooled sovereignty. And so, you know, in that sense, the split between middle and small on the one side and large on the other may remain. And, you know, particularly if it's large plus superpower power, there is an intransigence about concessions. But of course, and it was why the argument I made in 2007 about a big shock, you know, Franklin D. Roosevelt, in the thinking that led to the establishment of the UN, recognized that for the world's biggest power at the time, unless it was to bear the huge solo cost of being world policeman, an effective system of multilateralism was going to keep markets open for America, keep peace and security in a way that would prevent the necessary deployment of American troops overseas to secure it, and would keep, values and alive that America could subscribe to in large part around the world. And, he imagined the UN as somewhere where the US was going to get a great deal on its dollar. And, we will reach a point where the current sort of breakdown of world governance delivers a level of uncertainty and ungovernability, which will affect both Chinese and American business and financial interests, because both are so global, will increasingly impinge on their corporates' ability to sell and invest and act in foreign markets, and will ultimately affect the wealth and well-being of their citizens because of that degeneration or deterioration in global governance. So we will reach some tipping point where a strengthened international system, again emerges as something that most states can buy into and ready themselves to make the concessions it requires.
The Secretary General, as you know, has to lay out a common agenda report in September. If you were back on the 30th floor as Deputy Secretary General, what would you be saying to the Secretary General as to what should be the key elements in this common agenda report?
Thanks. I mean, from what I'm hearing, he's got, he's saying many of the right things. I know, some of the teams who are working on this, they're wonderful people, both inside the UN and the partners outside the UN Foundation, whose board I'm on and who I formerly was a co-chair of, is hard at work on this, as are others. And, more power to them. And there's a very good team on the Volker Turk and the team on the 38th floor. Excellent. And some of these concepts, like the sort of networked UN and the rest, I think, really are pushing in the right direction. But, I earned a reputation when I was on the 38th floor of, never being willing to take half a loaf, always wanting the whole damn thing. And, I think this is one of those moments where, Guterres, with the second term and therefore not facing a further re-election, has to show real courage and real ambition and fight for it. Because, if it's diluted down to just some sort of anemic platitudes about, more networked, greater role for civil society, do more on climate. No, this has got to be, the world needs an agenda. And perhaps, the most important concept that is associated with him, and which was in his Mandela lecture, and I understand will be a big part of his report in the fall, is this social contract issue, which I've always been deeply interested as well, which is there does need to be a social contract, not just between the UN and citizens, but via the intervening layer of national governments and other stakeholders. But it's time for a social contract where every citizen in the world, is promised a minimum set of rights and protections and support in their lives. And that this, is framed within a world which must change, but change in a way that it offers protection to the weak as well as the strong. And I think, there is, as Kofi Annan demonstrated in his 2 terms in office, there is a sort of pulpit and a platform for a Secretary General to be the articulator and champion of that more inclusive model of human governance at both the global and national level. And, Antonio Guterres is a highly articulate individual who's, in his own career as a prime minister and, as a leading social democrat in Europe, got all the intellectual capacities and the sort of articulateness to lead on something like that, as the Mandela lecture showed. Trump's gone, no excuses now. He's got to show the courage to lead.
Now, we've been having questions from the audience, and so let me start with one from Liz Howard, who is Liz's president of ACONS. And the question is, the peacekeeping budget is larger than the rest of the UN's budget combined. It is one of the most important and most effective instruments of the UN. You mentioned there have been no security crises on the scale of others: disease, climate, inequality. To what extent might it be possible to unite the UN Security Council around recognition that this instrument is working?
Well, I think it's a very good question, because it is working, as her research and others' research has shown. It does save more civilian lives at a lower cost than other peacekeeping models, because it requires a consensus. It's usually a light-armed model. It's not, if you like, an enforcement model of the kind that NATO or other bilateral security missions, the peacekeeping missions, often have to be or become. It depends above all on a certain degree of political legitimacy and acceptance by all sides that then allows this light model to really work effectively. And to an America withdrawing its troops from overseas, which in a sense bring the boys home, that refrain of American politics over more than a century, is what leads to these departures from Afghanistan, etc. And it would seem to be that, or you take on the other side, China as a very major, the biggest of the P5 contributors to peacekeeping, you might find a common interest about an enhanced peacekeeping role to save these countries, direct deployment of their troops in their own, in pursuit of the same objectives, cheaper on lives, more effective in outcomes, etc. But the challenge is going to be that will only work if we can preserve the UN and its activities as a kind of shared space where this US-China competition doesn't sweep all else before it. Because if that is the case, you can't see them agreeing on a peacekeeping operation which doesn't allow one an advantage at the expense of the other. And if we instead move to a highly sort of Cold War-like repolarized world, then whatever the economic and life-saving advantages of a UN peacekeeping model, it'll take second place to that superpower competition, if you like. Now, I didn't get into this in the speech, but I think there are restraining reasons why superpower competition, even absent the UN dimension, doesn't have to happen. This is not Russia and this is not Soviet Union and US. These are two economies, sophisticated economies, deeply intertwined in their investment, lending, and consumption behaviors. And it should be possible to find ways of managing their competition and finding areas where they can both collaborate and others where they may compete and confront. But if we can put on the collaboration side of the aisle not just climate change, but UN activity and peacekeeping, then maybe we can carve out the space for what Liz suggests. I hope so.
And we have a question from Craig Murphy at Wellesley College, and Craig is a past ACONS chair. It says, Mark, what can organizations of civil society do to accelerate the development of a multi-constituency UN system? Are there strategies that can be followed to move more quickly than just the quote-unquote quiet seeping?
Well, first, Craig is indeed a former ACONS chairman, in my mind, as importantly, also the historian of UNDP, who has written a brilliant book on UNDP during my time as administrator. And I think, Craig, this won't surprise you because you've heard me say similar things before. I in a sense think that you've got to look at this sort of courtship between civil society and the UN, you know, both at the top down and the bottom up. And the top down, you know, is, you know, representations in the kind of committee, conference, New York, Turtle Bay, and Geneva and Vienna type activities of the UN. But in many ways, the much more dynamic engagement is around the revolution that's already happening, as much more domestic southern civil societies are beginning to grow and flourish, as for different reasons non-local NGOs get either constrained by authoritarian governments and deregistered and delisted, or more healthily, many countries feel that they should have their own civil society structures to, you know, address their own domestic issues, whether they are humanitarian or developmental in character. And as that whole sort of ecosystem grows in size and ambition and complexity, you know, making it interlock with the UN system at the country level is critical. I mean, increasingly the UN, and I think of a country like Bangladesh, where there's a fabulous UN resident coordinator, you know, who takes a stand on the right issues as best as she's able to in a politically difficult environment. But a lot of whose success comes from partnership with Bangladesh's remarkably dynamic civil society. You know, I'm the lad here, I'm also on the board of BRAC, which is, you know, this massive, important NGO, which started in Bangladesh. And, you know, its capacity, whether it is to help in the Rohingya camps or to deal with the Bangladesh's issues of climate change and sort of empowerment and poverty reduction, its capacity far exceeds that of the UN, both in its staff on ground, its legitimacy and acceptance, you know, and the efforts it can mobilize. So, you know, there is a subtle shift at the country level from a UN-led effort with some sort of international NGOs, you know, franchised to support the UN activities, to a much more domestically driven infrastructure of civil society, where the UN is partner and guide and often protector of the human rights around it and the freedom of space to operate, but where it's no longer so obviously the senior partner as it used to be. So I would argue that far out of the sight of New York and its, you know, self-important government delegates, where the real UN meets the ground, that transformation to a new kind of UN civil society partnership is happening.
And we thank you for that, Mark. We have a related question, question related to Craig's, from Ellie and Emma, and they're two of our tireless ACONS interns. And the question, what are some of the sticks and carrots that not only civil society, but also UN officials can use for advancing the kind of networked multilateralism that you have mentioned?
Well, you know, again, I think it's going to grow, and I think that, you know, anyway, and, you know, I mentioned in my beginning, you know, groups like the G20, which are outside the UN. I mean, there are enough global problems that these mechanisms, you know, are going to grow, and they're not going to be increasingly just solely state to state kinds of networks. You know, the response to the pandemic draws in the scientists, it calls in big pharma, it calls in, you know, intergovernmental groups like African CDC, Centers for Disease Control, and others. And, you know, you've seen today, just last week, MasterCard Foundation giving $1.3 billion to the African CDC. So, you know, all sorts of networks of non-UN specific partnerships are growing. And the challenge for the UN is, can it place itself, you know, can it make the platform where these these networks get blessed and formalized and institutionalized the UN, or does it allow itself to become redundant to, you know, a sort of more sort of acronym confusing, not jungle, because it needn't be a jungle at all, but garden of networks with no single ownership structure that or universality that the UN provides. And I think that's the challenge. So sorry, just I mean to finish, it's going to network, but will the UN be integral to that network or sidelined? I think that's what UN people need to think seriously about.
Thank you, Mark. And we have a question from Professor Hiroyuki from Sophia University in Tokyo. Can the UN maintain its liberal value system and at the same time retain universality?
Very, very good question. And I think it's why I talked about the triangulation in which the Charter remains one corner of the triangle, and that corner is deeply protected by member states that, you know, believe strongly in not just the Charter, but the UN's universality. Because, you know, if it could remain universal, if limping during the Cold War, it should be able to pull off that, you know, that feat again. Even if, as I've argued, pieces of the apparatus like the Security Council may be largely redundant during this period. And, you know, that's, I think, the challenge, because, you know, the price the UN shouldn't pay is betrayal of the Charter. I mean, it shouldn't think that every values-based issue split the difference between China and the US. This was an institution based on a Charter which did have a heavy American influence, but which balanced that against the need for universality and the need for it not to become, you know, a sort of missionary to promote Western values at the expense of the rest. And retaining that balance, I think, is the right thing to do, but it, I acknowledge, very challenging.
And Mark, I'll just give a final question. I'll combine the question with a question which Professor Margaret Carnes has sent from the University of Massachusetts here in Boston. And Peggy was present at ACUN's creation in 1987. And she was wondering where leadership for significant reform might come today, given that we had leadership from FDR, who was instrumental in creating the UN. And I'll just add, what are the personal traits of leadership that you think will work in today's world? So where will leadership come, and what are the personal traits of leadership you think work in today's world?
Well, I think on the first, you kind of never know where leadership is going to come from. I suspect in this current environment, not from either of the two major powers, but more likely from somewhere within that nexus of middle income powers that I described. You know, and, you know, the two great Secretary Generals, Dag Hammarskjöld and Kofi Annan, you know, one from Sweden, one from Ghana, you know, very much in their times personified the ability of a UN defined space, and they were very different and difficult times. And Kofi was the lucky inheritor of a post-1989 world, which for once allowed the UN to spread its wings and fly. But I think, you know, it will need leaders who can find that. And I think, you know, the glory of today is they could come from all sorts of places. They needn't come from governments. They could come from within the UN system. They could come from civil society. They could come from science or the private sector. But what I think you can say about them is they will have two particular sets of attributes. One, again, as Kofi showed, the extraordinary ability to, in a modern media age, command a certain charismatic attention in a world which had wasn't used to listening to UN Secretary Generals, was not used to having a secular Pope around. And the second is the leadership style he embraced. You know, and I talk about this in the book that Abby referred to, you know, how it was so striking to me. At the time of the Iraq War, we saw lots of traditional leadership, red-faced leaders of Britain and America thumping their respective cabinet tables and demanding war against Saddam Hussein and wanting to roll over in their eyes, supine Security Council, which, you know, was in their eyes, you know, just losing the moment by its determination to make a better case for war before we went to war and to really prove there were weapons of mass destruction. And a Kofi style of leadership, which was this remarkable truth to the values and principles of the organization, but through that prism, reaching out to listen and hear the other side's point of view in the way which was inclusive of all and sought to find a consensus and a way forward. And, you know, I saw Kofi and, you know, as the beginnings of a new kind of leadership. And I think the debates in boardrooms and in foundations like my own and NGOs and governments around leadership and respect for the rights of those you work for, and inclusiveness across barriers of race or other division, you know, has socialized a new kind of leadership. And it was one that I was proud to serve one of its greatest champions, Kofi.
Mark, thank you so much for your compelling Holmes lecture and for being with us today. And I thank all those who have joined us across the world for being with us today. Many, many thanks.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you, Lise, and all your colleagues.